Disclaimer. This video is an exploration of the works of a horror movie director specialized in exploring childhood trauma and the aesthetics of dreams. Whilst I have no intentions of jump-scaring anyone with this video, it does carry an intentionally eerie feeling and showcases some potentially disturbing imagery. If this is something that is triggering for you, I would recommend you click off this video. Before we begin, I would also like to thank my former high school, Canada, for allowing me to film most of the footage for this video in their spaces. Thank you, and enjoy the video.
In this house.
Skinamarink is an analog horror movie created by the Canadian director Kyle Edward Ball and dedicated to the memory of the late assistant director Joshua Buchalter. The film was parodied after its first screening at the 2022 Fantasia Film Festival on the 25th of July. As a result, it has become a quick viral sensation and gained a cult following on the internet through websites like TikTok, showcasing the strange imagery of the film, most notably seen with a loud, ringing toy phone with bulging eyes. Whilst the piracy of the film was an unexpected setback, Ball did since explain that it had a positive impact on the movie's popularity in the end.
There are examples of piracy hurting a movie profoundly, and there are examples of piracy helping a movie profoundly, and we didn't know which way it was going to go, right?
Yeah.
This happened to be the exception, a example where the piracy likely did help the movie.
The film has grossed over $2 million since the official release, which very well may have not been the case had it not become an internet sensation. The film is now available for streaming on Shudder. You can also purchase a physical copy on Amazon. Today I would like to talk about Skinamarink, as I find it to be a really eerie and fascinating piece of media. However, I would also like to bring attention to some other works of Kyle Edward Ball. Skinamarink is what brought him to mine, and most other people's attention. It is his full-length debut, but he has a surprisingly vast catalogue of short films out there, in which he has slowly built up his style and aesthetic. I find these shorts equally as interesting, both in the way they show Ball's progression as a director, and as standalone pieces of disturbing media with some really original ideas. But first, a little bit about Kyle Edward Ball himself. Kyle Edward Ball is a Canadian director born in Edmonton and a part of new queer cinema.
And it's a weird thing too, because if you watch the Outwaters, so coming through the 90s and the 2000s, it felt like queer movies, they had to be overtly queer.
Yeah.
And now we're in this era where LGBT filmmakers don't feel like they have to shoehorn that in, and I can just make a movie about myself as a little kid, and there doesn't need to be anything necessarily LGBT in it. Or in the case of We're All Going to the World's Fair, playing with ideas of being trans and body dysphoria in such an amazing, weird way. And it feels like we are almost in, it sounds so pretentious, but even like post new queer wave cinema, right? Like,
he is most known for his distinct, lo-fi style, pulling large chunks of inspiration from dreams and childhood nightmares, as well as found footage horror. It is relatively difficult to find much information about him, as he is a relatively new face in the world of indie filmmaking. Most of what I have been able to find out about him comes from various lengthy interviews on YouTube, which he seems to have been very prone to doing.
The other night I had my friends over, and me and my executive producer, one of my executive producers, Edmund, we were just clicking around on YouTube on my TV, and there was this compilation of Soviet Union commercials from the late 80s.
Oh my God.
And I put it on, and he's like, "Oh, I've watched this a bunch of times." I'm like, "Really?"
His style likes to play with people's minds. It often doesn't show much and leaves a lot up to the imagination. I will expand on this later on in the video when talking about his films more in detail, but a lot of them feature an unusual amount of atmospheric shots, making you look for something in every frame. In spite of that, I don't believe his films have any sort of hidden meanings or intentions.
I like to tell a story, but not too much is how I would say it, right? Like just tell a little bit and let the rest of it sort of flow. And I think my big thing is I like to do emotions over story. Like that's my first and foremost thing is I want people to feel things before people think about it.
They are simply very abstract and ominous pieces of media. I might have a few theories as to what some of the imagery in his films means, but I believe a lot of the mysterious events can't really be explained. They simply happen as if they were supposed to, without the need for an explanation in the strange world which all of the works we are about to talk about are based in. First, however, let's talk about Liminal Spaces and Everywhere at the End of Time. Liminal spaces are something I find really hard to avoid talking about alongside a lot of Ball's work. Defined by Forbes as a place a person is in during a transitional period, liminal spaces are a genre of photography and film which typically carry the same kind of aesthetic and feeling. They are poorly lit, grainy, low-quality shots with no people in them, which feel very strange and alien, yet weirdly familiar and nostalgic. Defining what a liminal space is very difficult, as people mostly decide that based on feeling, rather than a defined set of characteristics. Whilst they often share certain aesthetic elements, almost none of them are a requirement for something to be a liminal space. I will leave a link to a very good video by Scrabble in the description, expanding on the idea of trying to define what a liminal space is. For the purposes of this video, however, they are low-fidelity pictures evocative of a strange feeling within people. They are mostly known for making people feel kind of uneasy, though they can also feel comforting to some people, including myself. The emptiness and otherworldliness can bring a sense of peace to one's mind. They quite often include places and objects we associate with our childhood as well, which can also help them feel like a safe withdrawal from the world. Liminal spaces have gained a ton of popularity throughout the internet, with lots of compilations and accounts dedicated to posting liminal and weirdcore pictures. There's even a viral found footage horror series by the director Kane Pixels based around the Backrooms, a specific liminal space with its own online urban legends, creepypastas, and theories based around it. Kyle Edward Ball's work is very reminiscent of liminal spaces. Pretty much all of his films pull inspiration from dreams, a world that isn't entirely real. To recreate this feeling, he often uses poorly lit, low-quality footage, which too feels very otherworldly and uneasy. Not all of it is necessarily liminal, but there are definitely many parallels between the two. He is obviously familiar with found footage horror and its place in internet culture, and utilizes it in his own dreamy way. Everywhere at the End of Time is an experimental ambient record by Leland Kirby, or The Caretaker. It is over 6 hours long, divided into 6 stages. The various stages represent the decay of the mind and the loss of touch with reality of a person suffering from dementia. The record simulates this feeling by taking old music recordings, looping and distorting them, adding all kinds of white noise, messing the sound up further and further until it becomes a desolate and disorienting soundscape. Similarly to Liminal Spaces, the album is famous for being very disturbing and otherworldly. It has been covered and analyzed by many people. The opening track of it, It's Just a Burning Memory, has even become a meme of its own all over the internet. I asked Kyle Edward Ball if he was familiar with the record, He responded saying he loves The Caretaker. I was almost certain he at least heard the record ever since I first watched Skinamarink, and I only got more and more certain the more of his work I delved into. The usage of old, distorted recordings to simulate the feelings of otherworldly dread is something Ball often uses in his films, even using the gradual distortion of sound to create build-up within them. There is even a Caretaker record titled Selected Memories from the Haunted Ballroom, a title which could very well be used for a lot of Ball's work as well. As a result of this, it'll be bringing up everywhere at the end of time quite a few times throughout this video. Someday I might be inclined to talk about it more in detail, as it is a really fascinating record, but this is all I have to say about it for now. Before creating Skinamarink, or branching into more lengthy films in any way, Kyle Edward Ball is relatively active on a YouTube channel called Bitesized Nightmares. The channel has been inactive for over half a year now, going mostly dormant after the release of Skinamarink. It has amassed over 41,000 subscribers and contains 59 videos, including various creepy radio recordings, as well as Ball's 28-minute film. Heck, most of the channel is, however, dedicated to a series called Nightmares. It is an amazingly original idea of recreating nightmares in film, starting with various nightmares found on Reddit, before people start sending him nightmares of their own. The series contains 39 episodes, most of which are very interesting, and quite disturbing. I personally couldn't watch too many of them at once, because I would get too afraid. They have a very special kind of immersive and surreal energy, since you have absolutely no idea what direction they are going to go in. All of them are filmed in first person, from the perspective of the person dreaming, which is perhaps the only way they can be experienced. I found it very interesting, watching them all in order, as it let me see the progression from the somewhat amateur beginnings of the series, with odd lighting choices, heavy, unfitting color correction, and a few moments where Ball's choice to narrate certain parts of the series really did him a disservice.
Thank you to everyone who liked and subscribed. This next nightmare was commented by Reddit user Xbox Gamer. This next nightmare was commented by Reddit user Bok Choi Sex Toy.
In spite of some obvious technical issues, Ball clearly had a very good idea of what he wanted to do. He had an understanding of how to build up to and film a good jump scare from the very first episode. He always had an understanding of the old school, ambient sound as well, with some very interesting and layered soundtracks throughout the series. I'll be very curious to see where did he find these, or how they've been constructed. Not every nightmare ends with a jump scare, which is something I came to appreciate the longer the series went on, as it made it very unpredictable. Some nightmares were a lot more uneasy and depressing, for example Cancer or Lava. Whilst others, such as Basement Stairs and Grin, are just aggressively terrifying. It is very nice seeing Ball really coming to his own throughout the episodes, getting more ambitious and competent with the variety of locations he films in, the people he occasionally gets to star in his shorts, as well as his visual effects. There are lots of dark blue tones, something that seems to really work with a dreamy setting. Some people take issue with Skinamarink's overuse of these types of shots, but I personally find them very fitting. I appreciate the space or mind to fill in that they create, both in Skinamarink and here. Whilst the series is clearly very restricted by its limited budget, Ball has been able to play to the strengths of that, creating a cheap, but efficient and consistent aesthetic. The grainy shots and the odd sound design work very well to create the feeling of a menacing nightmare. And the fact that these are nightmares does also lend credibility to a bit of oddity in the filming techniques, as it's hard to tell when something is a technical issue and when it is an actual detail within the dream. One of my favorite moments in terms of creative filmmaking comes from episode 9, Two Doors. We are looking at a door, but the camera never quite shows what's inside of it. Instead, it pans away towards the roof, showing a large shadow figure standing in the door. It builds up suspense, while simultaneously letting Ball depict a monster he most likely didn't have the means to fully recreate. One of my favorite things about the series at large are the character designs. Not every dream has a figure or a creature inside of it, but when they do, they are usually very memorable. In episode 15, The Foot of My Bed, you can see a figure in a dirty yellow room with very messy hair covering its face and a strange, partly see-through dress. From the very first moment I saw this character, I was both fascinated and terrified of what would happen next, and it's stuck in my mind ever since. A lot of Ball's work is reminiscent of sleep paralysis, a phenomenon in which you can't move while you partially regain consciousness. It is known for being accompanied by hallucinations, most typically of dark figures in one's room, or sleep paralysis demons. Nightmare 3, Tearing Sound, is a very good example of a depiction of sleep paralysis, though it only creates an atmosphere, doesn't actually involve any figures or demons. Nightmare 23 involves weird, warped faces with missing mouths and eyes. A huge part of the nightmare is spent looking at still shots with these faces. The entire episode feels as if they were right about to jump out at us, yet they never do. Nightmare 31 features what is essentially just two lights really high up in the dark, yet they create an instant image of a tall and scary figure in our head. Nightmare 29 is the most obvious depiction of a sleep paralysis demon, with a character which has been stuck in my head for days. I struggle to look at a dark door frame without imagining this face inside of it. It gets especially horrifying once it sits down next to the observer's bed, with some amazing sound design, fusing old school recordings with a brooding bass, creating an absolutely paralyzing atmosphere. All of this has been presumably only created with a few lights, prosthetic teeth, and a few recordings from archive.org, making it particularly impressive. It might just be my favorite episode in the series. Something I love to hear whenever it occurs is the way he recreates the kind of dream speak, using old, distorted recordings. I find it hard to believe this isn't in part because he doesn't have the voice acting talents to create convincing, nonsensical dialogue, but it fits very well, as voices in dreams definitely don't sound the same as in real life. I often hear voices in my dreams that sound normal to me in the moment, but I can't recall a single thing they've said once I wake up. Creating voices this way really helps the liminal vibe of the entire series, feeling as if we are between the regular world and somewhere else. The best example of this is episode 20, Distorted. In this episode, we are sitting in the living room with two other people, speaking to us in words we can't understand. Few more notable things about the series, as well as the tropes of Kyle Edward Ball films in general, are that he is really good at using silence and subtle noise to create the feeling of anticipation. Whilst the soundtracks can be creepy, the really scary moments usually only come in once the creepy soundtrack stops, as it offers at least some kind of distraction. The most bone-chilling moment of episode 15 is when the music suddenly stops, and we are left simply staring at the strange, messy character. His films don't like showing faces. In the entire Nightmare series, whenever faces make their rare appearance, they are obscured or edited in some way. Ball generally seems to have a very good idea of what not to show, when to let the viewer's imagination get the best of them. Throughout the series, I learned to appreciate the confusing and intentionally obscured filming methods as well. Once again, it is Ball deciding what not to show. Presumably a lot of these have been filmed in the same house, yet I barely have an idea of what this house looks like. Some things I will be carrying on from here to Ball's other works are the warped old school recordings. They'll be sticking around, though in a slightly different form. The liminal space aesthetics are here to stay, with the grainy and dark atmospheric shots which he has perfected in the series. Not showing faces is a theme he also chose to stick to, only rarely showing them even in much longer pieces of film. Not making sense in a traditional way is something Ball also seems to be a huge fan of. Even with films that aren't necessarily depicting any particular nightmares or dreams, He seems to enjoy following the dreamlike logic much more, where things happen without a proper rhyme or reason, yet still somehow feel cohesive. Of course, his creative approach to low-budget filmmaking also carries on to his other work. The only thing not coming along for his other works are the creepy character designs, which he seems to have unfortunately chosen to leave behind. All of these ideas would come together into what is essentially the bridge in between Bitesized Nightmares and Skinamarink. Heck. Heck is the 2020 film by Kyle Edward Ball from the official selection of 2020's Video Scream International Film Festival in the US. The film is a shorter precursor to Skinamarink, with a running time of 28 minutes, in which it definitively establishes Ball's very dreamy, lo-fi aesthetics, as well as his faceless style of horror, showing very little and explaining even less. Whilst the film is aesthetically very similar to Bite-Sized Nightmares, perhaps outside of the fact that the only music comes from the television this time around, it is very different in some key details. Whilst Heck does come across dreamy in its presentation, it isn't based on any particular dream, and as a result the story of it is a bit more cohesive. The events of it are still mysterious, but they are a little more conventional for a horror film. Heck is filmed in first person, just like Nightmares, but it is a found footage film. We aren't merely seeing what the main character sees, we see what the child is presumably filming. It makes the film feel a bit more immersive. Further adding to this feeling of immersion, the music and sound in the film comes only in the form of white background noise and the sounds of the television. There is no soundtrack, nor real music playing at any point. But perhaps most notably, it features no jump scares, which is a very interesting change of pace. The film kind of feels as if something was going to jump out at you the entire time, but nothing ever does. As a result, the film is more of a depressing, dreary landscape than a scary labyrinth. The description of the film reads, "A little kid wakes up in the middle of the night to the sound of his mom's television blaring. After looking around the house for a bit, finding out the door leading outside is locked shut, he starts looking for his mom, but he finds out her room is locked as well. After a little while he falls asleep. The time in the film is measured via sleeps, sounding fittingly childlike in that description. This is due to the fact that the night the film starts and never ends. We never see the house the film takes place in brighten up, which dawns on us more and more the longer it goes on. The time spans, the amounts of sleeps, get increasingly larger throughout the film, starting at 1 sleep, 2 sleeps, 5 sleeps, 23 sleeps, 49 sleeps, etc. Throughout the film, the boy gets increasingly more desperate to see his mom. At the start, he's simply looking for her, then says he's leaving to get her to reply, then saying clean up his room. As the film goes on, his attempts get more and more desperate and depressing. At first he's talking to the wind about how he colored all the carpet, hoping she would at least scold him. He then starts apologizing for having cancer, thinking perhaps that's the reason she's refusing to talk to him. In the end he says, "I hate you," I imagine towards his mom as well. All of this is interlaced with shots of his drawings all over the walls, of him and his mom. Compared to the Nightmare series, Heck is a lot more emotional, a lot more brooding. The jump scares and atmosphere in Nightmares get less and less scary the more you think about them, just like a dream or a nightmare would, as it makes no rational sense. The events of Heck only get more intense, sad and terrifying the more thought you give them. The events of the film are still somewhat surreal, but the main character is not simply a scared observer. They are a scared young child, somebody we can very easily empathize with, somebody with developed character, thanks to the film's longer runtime. If we take sleeps as days, it takes over 2 months, 65 sleeps, before the previously always locked door to his mom's room opens. We can hear his cries echoing throughout the house, before he decides to walk upstairs, finding the always locked door open. I really enjoy this kind of trope in strange media like this. The feeling that some kind of other entity is in control. Who opened that door? Why did they choose to open it at this time? We will never know, but I find that feeling of something greater being in control of the events of the film really fascinating. What follows is the closest we get to a jump scare in the entire film. The boy enters the room, seeing his mom sitting on the bed. We are unable to see her face, as is typical for Ball's work. The scene takes place in silence, but as we zoom out and see her face without a mouth, the omnipresent white noise gets much, much louder. This is a great example of a scene which gets more uneasy and disheartening the more you think about it. The very visual of his mom without a face isn't that creepy. It's what it stands for. She was most likely locked in the room the entire time, unable to say anything while her son was calling and crying for her to come to him. I've seen quite a few people describe this film as evil in the comment section. It feels like a very accurate description. It isn't a creepy film. It's a film that feels like it really wants to hurt its main characters. What makes it even more strange is that we have no idea why any of this is happening, who or what is behind it. Whilst it's easy to imagine an evil entity behind all the supernatural events inside of the house, I like to also entertain the idea it could simply be happening because the lack of explanation does make the entire film much more creepy, yet fascinating. The events from here on out begin to get more cryptic, leaving a lot up for the viewer's imagination to fill in. After 314 sleeps, we see strange black fluid flooding the roof. There is no explanation for it. We can only imagine what happened over the last 258 sleeps. 461 sleeps, we see a nightmarishly lit red scene, with the mother staring right into the TV, her face glued to the screen. She doesn't look entirely human. 18,694 sleeps. If we counted this amount as days, it has been over 51 years. The boy enters his mom's room, calling her one last time. There is a lot of distortion on his voice. It doesn't sound like he aged, more like he has been a child for over 50 years. I've seen many people speculate about his voice being destroyed by the terrors of the last 50 years, which seems very fitting, and most likely true. This film isn't what most people would describe when you ask them what they think hell is like. Yet it very well could be. A hell of an empty house, with lights which never turn on, with a boy calling for his mom to answer, and a mom listening to him without a mouth. Forever. Heck is a very fitting title for this film. A film about a child in hell. I find it very reminiscent of an old Terry Pratchett story. May he rest in peace. The story is titled 20 Pence with Envelope and Seasonal Greeting. It is a story about the coachman of a carriage that got lost in a snowstorm, entering a different reality, which too very much resembles a strange kind of hell. It also reminds me of Tony Domenico talking about operating on a foreign set of rules. Hell not being fully explained or shown leaves a lot up for the imagination. Outside of its depressingly mesmerizing plot and aesthetic, Heck notably has very few technical issues. Whilst I had some issues with the early episodes of Nightmares, and I will have a few technical issues with Skinamarink too, those don't show up here at all, throughout the full 28 minutes of runtime. It is still a low-budget, low-fidelity film, but there aren't many things that I feel could be improved with a bigger budget without changing the film's core principles. Overall, I see this film as a great precursor to Skinamarink, as well as a great film on its own. It is very emotional and heart-aching, while staying true to the traditional uneasy and disturbed vibes of a Kyle Edward Ball motion picture. Skinamarink is the full-length, 9-minute feature directed by Kyle Edward Ball, starring Dahlia Rose Troll and Lucas Paul as Kaylee and Kevin, and Jamie Hill and Ross Paul as their parents. The film has been created with a low budget of $15,000, 8.5 of which have been raised through a campaign on Seed and Spark, and was shot entirely in Ball's childhood home.
But on the last day when we were filming in here, I had this weird oh, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe the bedroom that I grew up in my whole childhood, which is now my mom's office, that I thought about for years as a little kid. Oh, one day I'm going to make a movie, that we're filming in here. This is so, and I said to my assistant director and my DOP, I'm like, this is so weird. I can't believe I'm filming in my childhood bedroom. It just feels so strange. And there was lots of little parts like that making it where it's like, that's weird that that happened, right?
It also uses public domain footage of old cartoons, as can be seen in archive.org, as well as freesound.org being credited in the film. Worth mentioning is the amazing trailer, which very well summarized the movie's aesthetics in little over a minute.
In this house.
I did the entire trailer before we even had distribution, and the trailer really did what it was supposed to do. It sold the movie so well, and even got us distribution, right?
Aesthetically, the film is very similar to Heck, Heck essentially being the proof of concept for Skinamarink. There are many similarities between the two outside of the aesthetics as well. Similarly to Heck, Skinamarink is described by many as a childhood nightmare, an embodiment of the worst fears you might remember from sleepless nights as a child. This feeling is created through many stylistic choices typical for Kyle Edward Ball.
Some of those were things that took budget into account, but other things were, well, it's a bit budget, but it's a bit, oh, that could help the atmosphere, right? And other things kind of blended together too. So I was able to film in the house I grew up in, and that a little bit was budget, but also a little bit, well, because it's so personal, that will by accident maybe help the way I approach writing the script, approach shooting it, approach editing it.
The film is as grainy and dreamy as ever, embracing the typical nightmarish feeling of his films. The voices this time around aren't represented by old recordings, but they are recorded in a very boxy and lo-fi fashion. It makes the film feel a bit more otherworldly, and adds a little special feeling I'll talk about more in the conclusion. The main reason for the childhood fear association, however, is in the very synopsis of the film. Two children wake up in the middle of the night to find their father is missing, and all the windows and doors in their home have vanished.
It's been years, so ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to do a big scary house movie. I think most horror directors do. And then after a while, through my YouTube channel, people kept commenting kind of shades of the same nightmare they remember from childhood. So I'm in my house, I'm alone, and there's a monster.
The very premise is based upon commonly shared childhood fears. The title of the film even originates from an old nursery rhyme from the 1910, Skinamarink.
In North America, there's a children's musical act called Sharon, Lois, and Bram. One of them has passed, but they still do stuff from time to time. And that's how I was introduced to the song, as a lot of other people in North America, particularly in Canada. And so that's kind of just an intrinsic part of my childhood. And so in that movie from the 50s, there's a kid's birthday party and they sing that song. And I'm like, what? That's from the 80s, 90s, right? And then I researched the song and I'm like, oh, it's actually a traditional song from turn of the century. It was originally in a musical, and even that, it may have come from word of mouth. For all we know, it comes from the Appalachian Mountains in the 19th century. We don't know. And I'm like, so I found it and I'm like, oh, this is actually not Sharon Lois and Bram. They've actually said, no, this is a traditional song that I heard from here, blah, blah, blah. So it batted around in my mind, and I'm like, A, that word is not copyrighted, so could maybe use it as a title. B, it checks a lot of boxes for me. It has a hard k sound in it, the two biggest brands in the world for a while, and I think this may be pseudo debunked, but we're Kodak and Coca-Cola, and there's an idea that the k sound has power to it. Scarred for life, for example. Then I said, okay, it's an earworm too. The word sticks in your head, the song sticks in your head. It's something that feels personal to me, but also feels personal to others. Excellent working title. I'll come up with a better title later. And here we are.
As somebody with a fair few memories of struggling to fall asleep as a child, this film really speaks to something in me. I can't imagine anything worse than walking through the dark house to my parents' room and finding out they're gone.
Can we sleep downstairs tonight?
Most fans of the movie seem to have a similar experience. This feeling makes the graininess of the film make more sense as well. When you are a child and wakes up in the middle of the night, you don't wake up to a well-lit scenery. You can barely see. You're very confused. It is difficult to make out what you're looking at. It works much better for this kind of film than a more glossy and professional-looking style. Adding further context to the graininess, the film is set in the year 1995. The very atmospheric feeling of the film is something I would like you to keep in mind throughout this examination. Going over the plot of the movie, please keep in mind a lot of this film is spent looking at various grainy shots of the house, and when we are looking at the children engaging in any sort of action, it is still filmed in a very obscured way, where they're either holding the camera, or a lot of them is heading out of frame or behind furniture.
I set out rules from the beginning. We never see the characters' faces. All dialogue is delivered off screen.
As I've said before, some people take issue with this. I personally really appreciate the ambient buildup of it all, even if it is a bit drawn out. I however won't be talking about it much, as the more atmospheric shots don't have much in them to talk about. They play with our imagination, but outside of that context they aren't integral to the plot in any way. In terms of the main plotline of the film, it can be quite difficult to make out at times too. Ball explains the film isn't entirely plotless. Technically, it does follow a pretty straightforward emotional curve.
People have said, and I know they're maybe using a term of art, but that the movie doesn't have a lot of plot, and I think there is a fairly definitive Hansel and Gretel plot to the movie. It does have a traditional, here are our characters, inciting incident, rising action, climax, end, right? Like, and yeah.
But what actually happens in the movie can be quite difficult to recapitulate.
There's some things that I don't even know if there is an answer. Like, there's a handful of parts in the movie where it's like, I don't know why that happened. I just wrote it, right? Like, yeah.
I remember trying to write down plot points after first seeing the movie, and only vaguely remembering what happened, with the timeline feeling all fuzzy and difficult to piece together. I will talk about them more once I get to them, but there are scenes in which it is, perhaps intentionally, very difficult to tell what is a dream and what is reality. I see the movie more as an ambient, atmospheric horror experience with a vague story behind it. Let's talk about the story. The film begins with a previously mentioned thank you to the late assistant director Joshua Buchalter. This film was very unfortunately his very last piece of work. The movie begins with a few establishing shots, including one of the glowing nightlight plugged in, and a painting of a lady whose face we can't see. We see a few shots of doors and windows, as well as some Lego. This is all imagery which is going to get more important as the movie goes on. The film feels as if we have woken up in the middle of the night. Everything is grainy, dark, and quiet. Some lights turn on, a child is crying, and the two main characters are introduced. The 4-year-old Kevin and 6-year-old Kaylee, little siblings. Their dad is talking to somebody about Kevin going to the hospital. Here, we first hear the odd quality of the voice recording. It sounds as if the speaker was really close to the camera.
So he's fine, but Kevin fell down the stairs and hit his head.
Kevin calls for his dad, but in that moment, he is no longer there, as there is no response.
Dad?
We see a few shots of the doors and windows in the house disappearing. They seem to be flashbacks. The children know the doors should be there, but they aren't. These effects are quite reminiscent of older films with well as advanced effects. Wells described on his channel as somebody inspired by old Hollywood trick photography. The children start looking for their parents, but much like in Hack, they are nowhere to be found.
Dad?
They decide to move downstairs, sleeping in the living room with cartoons on. Similarly to Hack, this TV is going to be the only source of sound and music for most of the film. It takes on the role of the lone source of comfort in the otherwise desolate house. At the same time, it gets more and more haunting throughout the film. Notably, the music is synced with the locations inside of the house changing, which is something I really appreciate. Here, we can first see the foreshadowing of something other being in the house. The light from previous shots has fallen out of the plug before plugging back in. We get some shots of a dark, ominous hallway behind the kids, which is going to become very relevant soon enough. The TV is used as a kind of storytelling device throughout the film, with the character rolling around in its bed as the kids too struggle to sleep. The footage is really nicely repurposed in similar ways throughout the film. After a bit of time, the kids begin questioning why nobody has come home yet.
How come no one's come yet?
We can only imagine what Kaylee has heard here, as we can't hear anything. We hear some rumbling around the house. The kids now find a chair on the ceiling. I very much appreciate the silence during this bit, as it feels a bit more realistic that paranormal activity like this isn't accompanied by various sound effects and creepy music. It simply happens, making it feel a lot more real, giving a sense of immersion. It feels reminiscent of the feeling Liminal Spaces have. Not necessarily the feeling of being freaked out, more so the feeling of something being off. Roughly around this time, the film begins to slowly get darker, as the various lights inside of the house go out, and the children are left walking around with only a flashlight, making the house much more unnerving. This piece of dialogue caught me by surprise. Why doesn't Kevin want to talk about his mom? Soon after, the toilet disappears too, in another one of the odd flashbacks. It is replaced with a bucket, which actually scared me, but solely because of the anticipation of something jumping out at me. The sudden movement and sound kind of freaked me out. I really appreciate moments like this. Moments which weren't intended to be creepy, and would perhaps be funny in another context, but which trigger the anxiety and unease the film creates within the viewer. The toilet disappearing feels like something that was also intended to create more of an unnerving atmosphere, but outside of a slight noisy disturbance, it didn't really do anything for me. The kids are now upstairs, with a flashlight, building tension similarly to some of the Nightmares episodes. After a bit of searching, they find a doll stuck to the roof. They stand there for a while, before Kevin drops the flashlight with a loud scream, saying he can't do it. Once again, I appreciate the psychological and tension-based aspect of the first real jump scare of the film. There isn't anything that scary happening. It's the build-up of all the strange events in the house, culminating in a moment of a child's psyche breaking. It's just a doll on the roof. It's just a doll on the roof in the middle of a dark house. It's just a doll on the roof in the middle of a dark house from which your parents have vanished. The children go back downstairs, where they build a Lego castle in front of the TV to cozy up. There are some more shots of the dark hallway. A pillow gets taken away by an entity we can't see. We hear a distorted, slightly feminine voice whispering to Kevin. What follows is a scene that very much got me. Reminded me of those scary nights I would go to my parents for comfort. Kevin walks into the parents' bedroom with his dad sitting on the bed. We can't see his face, we only see his stripped pants. Look under the bed, he whispers. In a really creepy shot, Kevin slowly looks under the bed, but he doesn't find anything there. It feels like the monster trying to get into the kids' heads, creating an illusion of their parents telling them to do intentionally distressing things. It also adds an element of unpredictability to the movie. You would expect a monster under the bed, but it's not there. Instead, once Kevin gets up from under the bed, his dad is gone. Instead, his mom is sitting on the other side. The scene is a bit confusing, as their mom seems to be talking to Kaylee. It makes you wonder if Kevin somehow turned into Kaylee while looking under the bed. What follows is a long, tense shot of the corridor. We can hear bone crunching, followed by a loud scream and a white flash. Once again, I love the huge amounts of build-up preceding the jump scare. Admittedly, it is a bit more freaky than the doll glued to the roof, but the build-up guarantees that once it hits, it really hits, even with its abstract nature. The way I interpret this scene is that both Kaylee and Kevin got called upstairs by the monster, Kevin meeting their dad, Kaylee meeting their mom. However, I believe their parents are gone. The monster created some sort of an illusion of them. If its intent is to play with the kids' emotions, there is very little that could be more devastating than having to listen to their parents getting eaten. Alternatively, this could have been a nightmare also created by the entity, as in the next scene, we once again find ourselves in the living room in front of the TV. Kevin is asking Kaylee where did she go. It seems she was the one upstairs. It is one of the scenes of the film I find a bit difficult to decipher. The TV is now showing a child in a spider web. On Kaylee's request, they block the scary hallway with a couch. The TV says, "I have a bone to pick with you." I'm not too certain this is intentional, But if it is amazing use of the source material. For the first time in the movie, the cartoon stops. One of the great effects of Skinamarink, similarly to Nightmares, is the true dread comes in once the sound gets stripped back to only white noise and breathing. Kaylee leaves, leaving Kevin to watch the cartoons coming on again. For a while, the movie turns into a compilation of atmospheric music and visuals. Kevin calls Kaylee's name, as she seems to have disappeared. He goes looking for her, walking around the house. I once again really appreciate the sound of the music and cartoons staying consistent throughout the house. Kevin is unsuccessful in his attempts of finding Kaylee. Coming back to the living room, the Lego city is quite diminished, with Legos on the wooden wall. The monster seems to be messing with gravity now, similarly to the way it put the chair on the roof, as well as the doll. It calls for Kevin to come to the basement. What follows is perhaps the most messed up and intense scene in the film. Kevin walks down to the basement, hearing Kaylee calling for his help, feeling scared, calling for her mom and dad. Once her cries go quiet, we see a long, shaky shot of Kaylee's legs, followed by a loud noise and a shot of Kaylee's disfigured face, without eyes and without a mouth. The scene works especially well in the context of Ball's mostly faceless films. We haven't seen the faces of neither of the children yet, and the only time we do, there isn't actually a face where you would expect it. The lights are flashing as Kevin runs upstairs. We can't see him, we only hear his terrified steps. The TV is now playing footage of a character trying to open a door, but finding door after door behind it. This, I believe, represents a seemingly weird, but solvable situation at the start of the movie, turning into more and more of a horrific struggle. Kevin is tossing and turning on the couch before the monster tells him to sleep. At this point, it seems the monster has fully seeped into the house. It can essentially do anything, having complete control over Kevin. The cartoon is now playing a clip of a rabbit fooling a dog. It stops, creating a very ominous, long pause. It turns on again, with the rabbit again disappearing into thin air. The footage keeps on chopping and looping, creating large chunks of silence interrupted by the same footage looping over and over. This seems to be foreshadowing, though for what, we don't know yet. I greatly respect Kyle Edward Ball for being able to create as much of a scary atmosphere as he does by simply looping cartoons. It is a great way of creating some very minimalist horror. After a while, everything stops and a snake plush disappears from the ground. I want to play, the monster says. This makes me particularly curious about its motivations. Is it simply a desire it follows to steal from children? Is it trying to manipulate and get into the kids' heads? Trying to hurt them as much as possible? Is it trying to understand the human world? Simply doing a horrible job? I feel manipulation and a desire to cause pain is the most likely, as all the monster has been doing has been nothing short of evil so far. But just like with Heck, I do wonder if its motivations simply aren't beyond our understanding. They very well might be, as Skinamarink really doesn't attempt to make us understand it at any point. We see more repeating footage of the rabbit and the dog, followed by a shot of Kevin sitting on the floor, breathing heavily. He was most likely woken up by the constant looping and unstable noise. We see a different angle and shot, a distorted voice reminiscent of Kevin's mom, followed by a flash of Kevin on the floor, and shots of the house interrupted by Kevin's pained cries. Another scene of great psychological horror, with the monster getting into Kevin's head so much it can essentially tell him to do anything. It is a bit confusing that he seems to be doing okay later. Perhaps he missed his eye? I find it difficult to believe this type of wound would heal so fast. This is where the part of the film which makes it really difficult to tell what's real and what isn't begins. Kevin once again wakes up on an order. Perhaps this all could have also been a dream. The screen is now completely white, playing what sounds like pitch-shifted music from the cartoons. Kevin decides to call the 911. Surprisingly, somebody picks up, and Kevin begins to explain what happened.
I hurt myself and I feel sick. Yeah. No.
He's struggling, however, as the operator asks him, "Is there somebody else with you?" Kevin looks into the dark hallway, unable to answer. The operator asks him to stay on the phone, but soon enough he drops it. Looking back at it, the scene strongly reminds me of dealing with somebody with a very oppressive or threatening personality. You aren't being hurt in the moment, but you very much feel the threat. In the following silence, the white noise begins building up, creating more and more tension. It gets louder and louder when it suddenly stops. The film here leads us to believe there is a jump scare coming up, but it defies this expectation by instead showing us the house being completely cleaned up. Kevin turns around to see what happened. This is the only time we see his face in the film. Even that is only from the side profile. This might have something to do with the eye he is not showing being messed up, though according to the 911 call it would seem he missed, and instead cut his skin somewhere.
How did you do that?
This dialogue is very creepy, not just because of what is being said, but the coldness and directness it is said with adds another layer to the uncomfortable nature of it. Whilst I'm not sure how to feel about the occasional theories about the film being about child abuse and abusive parents, I can definitely see where that connection comes from. When the monster says, "I took her mouth away," it shifts up in pitch slightly, sounding more like their mom. The monster asks Kevin to come upstairs one last time. And decides to really mess him up by putting him on the roof, making him walk upside down.
My DOP literally held it up, and he knew I could flip it in post, but he literally didn't even leave that to chance. He literally turned the camera upside down and held it up like that and walked.
And what
So,
kind
yeah.
of camera were you guys shooting on?
It was a Sony FX6, and we shot in like 4K RAW.
Oh wow! And then
Yeah.
you added all the grain and everything.
Yeah, like
post?
there's a little bit of the original grain, but not that much.
The events from here on out feel like an absurdist montage of ways the monster completely distorted Kevin's reality. First, he is walking into his parents' bedroom. This is a slight nitpick from me, but I can't get over the fact he walks over the lamp without any issues. Walking into the room, he begins drifting away from the door, finding himself, instead of in his parents' bedroom, in a hallway full of toys him, Kaylee, and the monster have been playing with throughout the night. We see text which reads, 572 days. Similarly to Heck, this is to imply the horrors in the house have been going on for a while. Unlike Heck, it feels a lot more random here. The movie was presumably happening during just one night up until now, yet it's now skipping over a year and a half forward in time. This is the scene in the film that convinced me Kyle Edward Ball must know everywhere at the end of time from the very first watch, as we see Kevin slowly drifting further and further away from the toys. The soundtrack of a cartoon is playing in the background, getting more and more soaked in reverb, getting noisy and distant, with layers of distortion all over it as the toys disappear in the endless, dark hallway. Something puts the lights out. Kevin finds himself looking at a bed with somebody, presumably Kaylee, sitting on it. The room stays silent as her head slowly disintegrates into the noise flooding the room. We see a visual of a house in the middle of nowhere, with incredibly reverbed echoes amplifying the surrounding feeling of desolate nothingness. What follows I can only imagine to be Kevin checking if everything had gone back to normal yet, as we're walking through the house with a flashlight. This is where the famous scene with the toy phone occurs, as a sort of departing freakout of the movie. Ironically, it is one of the parts of the movie I have very mixed feelings about. It did scare me, but it does kind of feel like it's just an unexpected loud sound. It isn't really built up on anything. It doesn't seem to be symbolic of anything. It feels a bit basic. My only idea, as far as the symbolism of the scene goes, is that those eyes might be Kaylee's. That might be me reading into the scene too much, however. There is one more visual of a corridor with something that looks like a weirdly deformed eyeball. We see a hallway. It looks a bit different, but I'm assuming it's the same one the monster has been in. We find it empty now. What follows is a very creepy compilation of photos of Kaylee. It still seemed to be her, but her face, and sometimes head, are always either deformed or completely gone. The scene feels like a nice calm down from the very tense atmosphere of the entire film, with a scene that isn't as harsh on the nerves, but is still very grim and disturbing. It is followed by one last trick the monster uses against Kevin. It is what has been essentially foreshadowed before by the looping footage of the rabbit disappearing. We see blood dripping on the carpet, followed by loud, distorted music from the cartoon, with blood splattering on the floor. As the last jump scare of the film, this one feels very underwhelming. I mostly appreciate the cheaper and more lo-fi aesthetics of the film, but I feel this is a scene where Ball bit off more than he could chew, with the blood effects looking incredibly cheap. This for once isn't helped by the fact that they loop over and over, with looming silence in between them. It is something that would normally work amazingly, but because we are looking at such a poor effect, seeing it over and over again does kind of ruin the experience. I'm not quite sure what happens in this scene either. Kevin seemingly survives whatever horrors he's put through, but it is never explained. We aren't even really given a hint. We can imagine him repeatedly disappearing like the rabbit, but that doesn't change the fact that there is blood all over the carpet. While Skinamarink is very interesting due to how little it likes to explain itself, this feels like something we should have at least a slight understanding of, at least a little bit of knowledge of what is happening. There is something we aren't being shown, but we can't quite imagine what it is, as we have zero clues for it. We then see Kevin looking at a now dark TV, asking if they can watch something happy. He finds himself laying in bed, looking around a dark room in typical Kyle Edward Ball fashion. Revealing a grainy face, barely visible amidst the brown wall of noise. Whilst it feels like the movie is going to close on the monster finally revealing itself and jumping out, it instead stays unpredictable, with the monster hiding in the noise until the very end. Kevin merely asks what is its name, but the monster doesn't answer. That is the end of Skinamarink. Skinamarink is not a perfect movie, but it is genuinely frightening in a very new and original way, with a distinct style. It evokes feelings within me very few pieces of media do. It is that feeling of childhood terror, something I don't find myself coming back to much at this point in my life. But Skinamarink brings it right out with its eerie visuals and liminal aesthetics. It brings a kind of horror often seen in alternate reality games and various strange pockets of the internet to the big screen, which is something I have a lot of respect for. Another feeling I really enjoy about it is the otherworldly energy radiating from this film. Whilst it doesn't really make sense, I like to enjoy it in the same way I would an ambient or experimental record from somebody like 103.Never or William Basinski. Even with the ending being as strangely confusing as it is, it feels in line with the overall movie experience. A thing I wanted to note is the boxy audio contributing to its almost strange aftermath of the film as well. After watching it, I am admittedly already creeped out quite a bit. It is messing with my view of reality. It doesn't help the audio of the film very much sounds the way my voice sounds in my head. I'm not sure if this is intentional, but if it is an amazing idea, and definitely something that I hope to see explored further.
The thing is, a lot of times in movies, things happen by accident or on purpose, and the lines between those two kind of blur. So,
with all of that said, this film is not beyond criticism. Unlike many other people, I don't have an issue with its running time. I enjoy the film throughout and feel its length is appropriate. However, I do wish the last leg of the film was stronger, a bit more cohesive. In a lot of ways, I just can't help but feel like it's just a compilation of leftover jump scares from the shooting of the movie. I wasn't too surprised to find out the phone scene wasn't even originally supposed to be there.
There were a handful of things that were heavily repurposed, like oddly enough, the phone jump scare is not in the original script. Originally in the script, it's one of the cartoons that they were watching was supposed to be there.
The technical issues are fairly obvious at a few points too, most notably with a weird-looking blood splatter effect. I respect the film for being as competent in accomplishing its goals most of the time as it is, having as low of a budget as it does, but that doesn't excuse issues like this. I would like to thank the To Be Honest podcast for putting me onto this movie. Thank you to the entire cast. But most notably, I would like to thank Nerd City for pointing out some technical issues I wouldn't have noticed otherwise.
See, that's one of the things that I thought was funny. I think I've complained on this podcast before about how these apps that have filters that are like multi-generational, you'll have the film filter with light leaks and then grain from old film, and then you have VHS filters from the tracking mistakes of VHS, and then you have chromatic aberration from old TVs that you'll get. Like the kids who didn't grow up with all of those things to know what they relate to, mix them all together and don't realize, like, for this to happen, it would have to be like a projected movie shot on 16 millimeter that then was like recorded off of a television.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like,
And then on VCR as well.
Right. So then this movie, it says 1995 at the start, but it's using 1975 low budget horror film aesthetic. Like, even that font is iron-on letters from the 70s. So the reason why I think they did that also comes back to the budget.
I don't have the knowledge of film history to notice things like this. However, even without knowing it, I occasionally found myself wishing there was a better explanation for the noisiness of the film, something like the otherworldly presence warping the recordings. It would, for one, be a much cooler way to get around it, and would have helped the film evade some inconsistencies with its effect and toys, some of which haven't been made available until long after the year the film is supposedly taking place in. I don't think I would say Heck is a better film, as it is much shorter, and just very different in terms of the emotions it is trying to evoke in the viewer, but in terms of clear themes and technicalities, it is a much more cohesive experience. Skinamarink reminds me of Kanye West's 808s and Heartbreak. 808s is a record that is beloved for its groundbreaking new sound, responsible for the sound of hip-hop for years to come, as well as the blaring passion with which he delivers the very out-there sound. However, similarly to Skinamarink, once you get into the details of the record, it is very obviously flawed. Kanye is not an amazing singer by any stretch of the imagination, but the record is still a very strong and emotionally potent artistic statement. I can sit here and pick Skinamarink apart all day, but the fact of the matter is I was absolutely mortified for most of it, in a way that I haven't felt in a very long time. Obviously, there is no way of knowing if Skinamarink is going to be influential in the grander scheme of things, but it's certainly a very original and passionately crafted project.
Put so much time and approach things uncynically and from a good place, you'd be surprised how often things like that happen.
Behind the entire film, there is a single man with an idea. He doesn't have a ton of money to spare, but he starts a campaign with which he gets a good portion of his budget, and creates a film which has been seemingly forming in his mind for years.
I did, first and foremost, I did say, okay, don't worry about trying to get in other people's heads. Just try to make a movie that you think you would like. And I kept that as my kind of North Star, but a big thing that also guided me was, okay, try to do something different because people want to see something different. And then after that, it was like in my dreams, I would like always want to be the next Blair Witch Project, but I would always couch that in reality, and it happened.
Inspiringly, this film, made for the minimal budget of $15,000, has grossed over $2 million by the time of recording this audio.
I would say I paced myself so much. So I did my nightmare videos, kept doing those. Then I did a 30-minute, then I did the feature. And it felt like I did things in so many baby steps.
Skinamarink is a prime example of a film in which the idea trumps the presentation. In terms of its technical competence and following traditional filmmaking rules, it has little to nothing to offer. The entire movie is poorly lit, with lots of shots of random, seemingly inconsequential objects and rooms. Ironically, breaking all of these rules helps it stay on the edge, whilst keeping the audience on the edge as well. Skinamarink is not a perfect movie, but it is an impressive artistic statement, held together by a singular idea. The idea of a little boy in a big, scary house.
Through the whole process, I did want to really replicate the feeling of being a little kid in the house in the dark. And I think a lot of people with their movies, they want to achieve that, but I'm so thrilled that people have actually responded to that in such a profound way.